of, borderline criminals and borderline drug takers?
Well, some of them, it's not a question of coming in. Many were born here and grew up here, but and the problem is not just in this country. We have to be slightly careful, of course, because the person involved has been charged,
sure,
but not convicted. So I won't say much about the Reading, the Forbury Gardens case, if I may. The first thing I have to say always about this is that people will immediately accuse me of making apologies for or excuses for Islamist terrorism. I have no desire to do that at all. I hate terrorism with a passion, and all those who take part in it, and I did. And this has nothing to do with making excuses for it. It's just if we treat events such as the Forbury Gardens events and such as several others which have taken place recently purely as matters of some kind of Islamist conspiracy masterminded by a turbaned genius in a cave in Afghanistan, we won't actually protect ourselves against them, because what you much more often find in these cases is that the people involved are in some important way deranged and have long records of drug abuse. And it's not just marijuana, by the way, that is the most prominent drug in all this. Steroids also seem to me to be involved. And most people don't even know, for instance, that Anders Breivik, the man who conducted the terrible massacre in Norway, was on steroids, and you only know about it because he boasted about it in that revolting testimony.
Right. And are these steroids
that he was also true of Martin, the man who took part in that nightclub massacre in Florida? Again, steroids, and also Raoul Moat, who you may remember went on a rampage. So in European countries, what tends to happen is that people say, oh, well, it's Islamist. In the United States, it tends to get tied up in an argument about gun control. But in both cases, it seems to me people are missing the point. This is quite a new phenomenon, and it stretches across enormous numbers of crimes, and it is much, much more to do with people taking serious quantities of mind-altering drugs and becoming unhinged.
Yeah.
And if we don't look at this, if we treat all these things either as instances of terror or as instances of breach of the failure of gun control laws, I think we may probably not be protecting ourselves against quite a grave danger.
Yes. Well, I think if you look at the marijuana sort of conversations that people have now in this country, I mean, you don't have to go very far walking around the streets of London, I know what Oxford's like, before you can smell the whiff of somebody smoking a joint. Certainly, I was in California not that long ago, last year I think it was, and it was quite unnerving to see all these posters advertising marijuana, walking past or driving past marijuana shops, marijuana superstores, even advertising hoardings saying, for sale plots of land to grow marijuana. I had my children in the car, and I said to their mother later, I said, it's very difficult to tell them that these things are bad if they're legal.
Well, it is, and that's one of the reasons why I oppose so much the idea of legalizing. And legalization means, amongst other things, the thing being on sale eventually in supermarkets, and advertised on the television, particularly. And this is particularly in Proposition 64, which was the campaign to legalize marijuana in California. Specifically, it's a very long proposition too. If you read it, specifically requires advertising to be legal. And you're quite right. Once things attain that kind of commercial respectability, it's extraordinarily difficult for parents, teachers, or anybody in authority to say to the young that this thing is terribly dangerous, stay away from it.
Right.
But it is, and it's not just it turns up in an awful lot of what is nowadays described as low-level crime, what in my childhood and teens would have been seen as outrageous, but quite large numbers of seriously violent events which happen in our society. And there's a very interesting website called Attacker Smoked Cannabis, in which a friend of mine has compiled month after month after month, usually from local newspaper reports, the huge number of serious violent crimes in which the culprit has turned out to be a long-term user of marijuana.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the underworld, such as it's not really called anymore, but certainly the drug gangs of London and other parts of the country they may not be only dealing in marijuana, but they're certainly dealing in marijuana. They're making a vast amount of money in it. Loads of it's being grown now in this country, hydroponically in underground warehouses that probably make millions and millions and millions of pounds every single year. I mean, is there a point at which you have to accept that it's impossible to stop, and therefore you try to regulate it somehow?
Well, there are two things wrong with that. One is that a regulation doesn't really mean anything, and cigarettes and alcohol are regulated and do terrible, dreadful damage. And people often say, well, if you're so against marijuana, why don't you want to ban cigarettes and alcohol? So, well, actually, if either of those things were introduced now and were not yet in mass use, and there was a campaign to legalize them, I would certainly be against it. And personally, if I thought it was possible, I would think it's well worth seriously considering banning both of them. But the trouble with drugs is that once they're in mass use and legal, then it's almost impossible to ban them again. And attempts have been made to do this in the United States and in Iran, and they've completely failed. And that's why the irreversibility of legalization is why it's so dangerous. So that's one thing. The other thing, it can actually be controlled in two major free, law-governed, advanced countries in the world, that is Japan and South Korea. It is still a serious crime to be caught in possession of cannabis. And as a result, the level of use is much, much lower in both those highly successful societies. This isn't some kind of Philippines shooting drug dealers rubbish or death penalty for drugs. It's serious countries with serious legal systems and police forces actually imposing and enforcing the law, just as we used to do before about 1967, quite successfully again, but then there was a long campaign to get rid of it. So we still have laws against marijuana, which appear to be quite strong in this country, but in fact they're not enforced. So
well, it's practically decriminalised in this country, unless they find you with a huge bale of it in the back of the car.
A former head of the flying squad said as long ago as I think as 1994 that marijuana was a decriminalised drug in this country.
Yeah.
And he should have known, it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely right. And what about the whole business of, the way that somehow cigarette smoking has become more or less banned on the streets of Los Angeles, but you can walk around smoking marijuana. It's one of those kind of paradoxes that we now find ourselves in, similar to the one that I saw last night on Country File, where a rescue team from the Wye Valley confessed that because of COVID-19, if they rescue you from the water and you're out of you're unconscious, they're not allowed to give you the kiss of life.
Oh my goodness. There are all kinds of madnesses. But I have to say, I mean, when I was researching the book that I wrote about the marijuana problem, one of the things I looked up was the old newspaper archives about the argument about banning cigarette advertising, and many of the arguments used by big tobacco in those days are almost identical to the arguments used now by campaigners for legalization of marijuana. Totally irresponsible and dishonest claims that there wasn't really any danger.
Right.
And there is a very distinguished psychiatrist, Professor Sir Robin Murray at the Maudsley Hospital in South London, who has come over the years more and more and more certainly to the position. You can't be certain because causation is incredibly difficult to prove, that the use of marijuana is strongly linked with development of mental illness. And my friend Patrick Coburn, probably the greatest foreign correspondent in the country, works the Independent, his son Henry fell victim to this at the age of 11 and 12 at a grammar school in Kent. Imagine any more sort of secluded, lovely, safe place you might think, but no, he was introduced to marijuana at school and has had for many years terrible, I'm afraid, irreversible mental problems.
Yeah.
Patrick has very bravely written about, and he's pretty much certain that it was marijuana that brought this about.
And I think we all know someone like that who has had a family member suffer as a result of really, really serious, because it's very strong now compared to what it was in the 60s.
Yeah, it may be. I mean, I was contacted some years ago by a woman on Merseyside whose husband had smoked the supposedly milder form of marijuana for many years, and she'd been worried about it, and he said, no, this is harmless. And then one day he had actually gone completely insane, and about a dozen police officers had to come to the house to remove him to the secure mental hospital, where, as far as I know, he still is. So I wouldn't get it's a dangerous drug, and nobody really knows who's going to be affected by it. It would be extraordinarily dangerous to make it legal. And when Patrick came out with his story about what had happened to Henry, he was astonished by the number of people who came to him, colleagues who he'd known for a long time, said, "Do you know the same thing has happened to me?" It's a very common thing, but it's not spoken about. People are embarrassed about it and frightened to speak about it, but it's extraordinarily common in our society, this link. And yet in the world of politics and much of the media, it's treated as almost a joke, as if it would, when they're wacky-backy, just a little laugh, nothing to worry about. But if you've ever visited somebody, as I have, in the locked ward of a mental hospital, and you see, and you see the amount of tragedy which is being caused, and many of these people can't go to mental hospitals because there's no room for them. They're shoved out into the community, which is why they end up doing terrible things.
They end up doing terrible things. Well, exactly right.
It is so serious, and people will not take it seriously.
We say, and I ask you to say